Over the course of our country's history, we've had several different major epochs of antitrust enforcement and very different ideological and political assumptions about the proper role of competition and the proper role of the antitrust enterprise. I recently had the opportunity to do some work on a 1940 Supreme Court decision called U.S. versus Saccone Vacuum that nicely illustrates this principle. When Franklin Roosevelt was first elected president in 1933, the country was in the middle of an economic depression. And initially, Roosevelt's strategy was to replace competition with industry cooperation supervised by government bureaucrats. Roosevelt appointed his Secretary of the Interior as Petroleum Administrator and charged him with helping the oil industry organize itself to avoid wasteful overproduction. In 1935, the United States Supreme Court invalidated the statute under which Roosevelt had acted in appointing the Petroleum Administrator and asking industry to organize itself through cooperative codes. That decision by the Supreme Court precipitated a radical ideological shift within the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt appointed as head of the Justice Department Antitrust Division vigorous and strong proponents of antitrust enforcement. A few years later, that very same antitrust division brought criminal price-fixing charges against the very industry executives, the oil industry executives, that Roosevelt and his Secretary of the Interior had just a few years before charged with stabilizing oil prices and limiting production in the industry. Now, you can imagine how those oil industry executives reacted. How could the very administration that asked us to do this thing for the good of the country now turn on us and accuse us of being criminals for engaging in this business conduct? When the case reached the Supreme Court in 1940, the Supreme Court had come to be dominated by justices who adhered to a pro-competition policy, the competition of the second half of Roosevelt's New Deal. They rejected the oil executives' plea and held that price fixing is per se illegal, regardless of whether or not the government encouraged that behavior. Saccone is an extraordinary story about how quickly ideological commitments can change even within a single political administration. The role of a good lawyer is to keep his or her eye not only on legal doctrine, but on the prevailing social, political, and ideological currents that affect your client's interests.